Thanks so much, Peggy. Once again, I'm going to read, but intermittently with making comments all along. So my purpose here is a humble one. I don't know that there is a way to talk coherently about the dilemmas of the entire continent as far as LGBTIQ activisms are concerned, or women activisms. I hope that the experiment I have chosen here to use can repudiate a few of the mystifications that pertain the state of activism and LGBTIQ peoples in Africa. But first, I want to outline 3 registers of subjectivity, subjectivity being that thing that articulates or expresses what kind of being you are. Because the register within which I want to do the experiment is one that's not familiar, but one that I think is very useful, being that we're talking about the continent of Black people. The first register is that of pre-conscious statements. So the ability of people to make statements and self-actualize by saying, I am Black, I am a woman, I am gay. And this is the register, by and large, of like the social sciences and filters a lot into activism work, into making pre-conscious statements about our own identities and who we are. The second register is that of unconscious identifications. This is concerned with desires, fixations. It's unconscious as a register, and you're not in touch with it all the time, but it is as much a part of you as that register of pre-conscious identification. And it is the register of the humanities. But the third is the register of structural positioning. This register was popular in the 70s, but with the period of crushing activism work, particularly intellectual activism, it kind of died down, so that we are really used to the first 2 registers, but not the third. This is a paradigm that exceeds and anticipates you. So you don't structure yourself in these ways, you don't self-identify in these ways, but you are nonetheless as much that structural position as you are in the ways that you do self-identify. I hope that makes some sense. So there's something quite unique about the living of queer Black African bodies and the rest. These are lives whose very existence and issue is structured by violence at every turn. And I'm glad that the speakers here have talked about the specificity of the ways in which violence overturns the lives of queer women in the African context. Where the question of LGBTIQ plus movements and people is legality, the acceptance and extension of rights for the Black body, it seems to be along the familiar fatal spectrum of violence and death that envelops the Black world par excellence. At the same time, the violence obscures even our understanding of gender as standing on its own to articulate bodies. Black people, and here I quote Ziad, Black people are out of step with womanhood and manhood. Black gender is always gender done wrong, done dysfunctionally, done in a way that is not normal. And thinking through my engagements here, I was very much inspired by Ziad, who has an experience quite like Fanon's experience with the look mama, a Negro, when he arrives in France, with a child on a train who's just like, why are you not a normal boy, when looking at him and his partner? And he's the one who takes me back to thinking this experimentation through the structural position, through a really excellent Black radical feminist by the name of Hortense Spillers. And Rose. My gender, and here I insert sexuality, is Black. That is why our queer expression of Black gender is such an affront to the world stage created. Black gender, and anyone who embraces its margins, were never supposed to exist comfortably in this world in the first place. A world we're taught to try to become part of, just like so many of us were, just like I was, even if, little boy, he is destined always to fail. In Spillers' essay, Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe, she argues that gender has been configured for Black people through slavery and its afterlife, and is outside of what she calls the American grammar, and here read the world grammar, calling it the dehumanizing, ungendering, and defacing project of African persons. Spillers points out how historically, black gender has not been used to indicate a shared womanhood or manhood with people within white society, but to highlight how black people are out of step with womanhood and manhood. Black gender is always gender done wrong, done dysfunctionally, done in a way that is not normal. And here is where the resounding question of like what a lot of people think of as early black feminist statements by Sonja Truth, ain't I a woman, is really important for our meditations, because what kind of conditions create a question like that? Why does she ever ask? And is the answer always automatically yes? Or should we acknowledge that the way she's structured in the world as an anti-human means that her gender subjectivity is a question, and the answer then might be no, you're somebody else that is outside of the world's grammar and capacity to articulate gender and sexuality. Sharp, reading Spillers, thinks that this flesh, the black body, or 0 degree of social conceptualization, as Spillers puts it, has no human subjectivity, no gender, no history. It is merely commodity and subjected to civil society's whims, yet with no part in its design. This flesh was not only cut off from its history and culture, dispersed across the world, it can also constantly be cut off from lineage and constantly open to legal rape, transforming birth to the mere reproduction of commodity, placing the notion of familial connectedness permanently under threat. Even if we didn't have the language to describe this experience, most black people live through it. That's why when you hear the experiences of people in the diaspora and on the continent, something seems to always come back to this one state of one's body. This is why black boys are hyper-criminalized, just as black girls and other black non-male children are made invisible when talking about the issue of black children. But instead of accepting the impossibility of black gender as a reality and using it to create a different, freer understanding of being, we're pressured to force our way into this category that doesn't quite ever fit comfortably, specifically a category created specifically for our exclusion. This pressure to salvage something of this anti-black world rather than to reject it fully is part of why we insist on going out of our way to prove a manhood, a womanhood that was never ours to have in the first place, at the expense of trans, non-binary, queer black folks alike. Any attempt to fulfill gender roles as outlined outside of blackness is not only ultimately futile in gaining black people some sort of access to human treatment, and remember again, we're talking in the third register, but it also reinforces the violence against black people who are attempting to build worlds that embrace their non-conformity. This attempt to normalize gender translated to violence against queer experience, against my queer experience. But attempting to normalize a queer experience without reckoning with the specific role of blackness outside of the universal grammar can reinforce anti-black violence as well. This is why when black and white queer people come into conflict, and here is a case study that comes from one of the pride parades that we had in Johannesburg in the northern suburbs, where black women under the organization 1 in 9 asked to stop and have a moment of silence carrying, what do you call them, mannequins of black women, laid them on the ground and asked to have a moment of silence for the many black women who are killed in South Africa for being lesbians. The altercation that ensued between white and black queer peoples resulted in the state intervening on the part of white people and those black women being effectively told to go back to their townships. So when they're in conflict, the state's response of protecting the humanity of white persons is always predictable. To argue that my gender is black, my sexuality is black, so seeing gender and sexuality through black is not to ignore our different experiences within blackness or to raise the unique struggles of different gender non-conforming individuals. It's simply trying to emphasize the importance of recognizing how none of us black folks can conform to manhood, womanhood, as those constructs have been formed, as those constructs have currently been formed, nor can we even conform to queer, trans, and non-binary genders that that way either, the way that makes the state recognize us as human. This is Ziad again. This is also not a race-first argument as propelled by anti-woman components in order to obscure cisgender, heterosexual black men and the violence that they commit intramurally against the rest of us. Thinking about gender and sexuality through blackness is an argument that is rooted in the understanding that blackness is not a race and therefore could not be race first. In the afterlife of slavery, and here I borrow from Saidiya Hartman again, blackness is that which is denied access to humanity, and thus blackness is denied access to human gender, sexual identity as well. Because the black people we read as queer or as women epitomize the lack of access to gender uniquely, and forefronting blackness is actually an attempt to bring these realities into the conversation about anti-blackness in a necessary way as it relates to sexuality and gender. So my gender is black, my sexuality is black, is also not an argument against using the terms that dictate gender for black people. We're operating within a language that does not give us room, and that many times we just have to make do in the darkness within those subjectivities. Part of creating a space that doesn't make room for black people is acknowledging the ways our current conceptions of gender are limited, and try not to make any permanent home within the language, even if we find it useful at this time. This requires a rediscovery of the ways we can relate to ourselves and our bodies in conducting our freedom. Gender identity under whiteness is a tool, not an end. How do we get to that end? That world in which all of our genders, our lack thereof, aren't used as a basis for our inhumane treatment. That's the question. That's the question Ziad poses so strongly. It would be more amazing if we could protect black being by harnessing such critical perceptions to disrupt rather than idealize the world that calls the subjection of black people normal, or things I was talking about as comfort the world sits in with black subjection and suffering. We need to question any feminist critical grammar that reproduces any proper apprehension of female or the feminine while exposing the limits of what constitutes proper subject subjection. Here we have our best chance of disordering the modern grammar because we have a positionality that best questions its assumptive logic. We enter into Audre Lorde's turf of double refusal, the refusal to disappear and be hyper-visible at the same time. Thank you.